Margaret Turner was a kind and quiet woman in her 70s who lived alone in a small, peaceful neighborhood. Her closest companion was her loyal German shepherd, Rex. To most people in the neighborhood, Rex was just a big, intimidating dog. But to Margaret, he was more than that. Rex was her protector, her best friend, and a constant source of comfort. Margaret had adopted Rex years ago after her husband, a veteran, passed away. At the time, Rex had just retired from the U.S. Army as a service dog. He had been trained for dangerous missions, working alongside soldiers in war zones. Although Rex was now enjoying his quiet life, Margaret knew he was still capable of incredible things. She had seen it in his sharp eyes and the way he always seemed to be watching, protecting her from any potential threat. It was a beautiful evening, the kind Margaret loved. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood, and the cool breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. With Rex by her side, she decided to go for their usual evening walk through the park. It was her favorite part of the day, a chance to enjoy nature and stretch her legs. As they walked, Margaret greeted her neighbors with a warm smile. Some waved back and admired Rex, commenting on how obedient and calm he was. Others crossed the street to avoid him, intimidated by his size. Margaret always laughed quietly at that. She knew Rex wouldn't hurt anyone without reason. But tonight was different. Rex was unusually alert. His ears perked up, and he kept glancing around, as if sensing something Margaret couldn't see. She noticed his behavior and gave his leash a gentle tug. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. Rex didn't respond, but his sharp gaze didn't waver. Unbeknownst to Margaret, two men were watching her from a distance. Kyle and Derek had been lurking around the neighborhood for weeks, looking for easy targets. To them, Margaret seemed perfect, an elderly woman walking alone with her dog. What could possibly go wrong? They exchanged glances and smirks, confident that the evening's job would be quick and easy. Margaret continued her walk, unaware of the danger. She passed the park's playground, now empty as the sun began to set. The area grew quieter, with fewer people around. Rex remained on edge, his body tense. Margaret began to feel uneasy, but she shook the thought away. "It's just your imagination," she told herself. The two men moved closer, sticking to the shadows. Derek whispered, "You distract her. I'll grab the purse." Kyle chuckled. "She won't even see it coming." Neither of them paid much attention to Rex, assuming he was just an ordinary dog. As Margaret turned onto a quieter path, Rex suddenly stopped. He stood still, his ears forward, and his muscles rigid. Margaret frowned, looking down at him. "Rex, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. In the distance, Kyle and Derek crept closer, ready to make their move, but they had no idea what was about to happen. Margaret paused, tightening her grip on Rex's leash. The dog's body was stiff, his head low, and his eyes focused on something ahead. She followed his gaze but didn't see anything unusual. The park was quiet, the fading sunlight casting long shadows over the empty paths. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Still, Rex's behavior made her uneasy. "Come on, Rex," Margaret said softly, trying to urge him forward. But he didn't budge. Instead, he let out a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Rex wasn't the type to growl without reason. Hidden behind the bushes, Kyle and Derek watched Margaret. She was exactly where they wanted her, alone on a secluded path. Kyle smirked and nudged Derek. "You ready? This'll be easy," he whispered. Derek nodded, adjusting the knife in his pocket. "Old lady won't know what hit her," he muttered back. Neither of them gave Rex a second thought. To them, the dog was just a pet, probably too slow or too old to cause any trouble. Margaret's unease grew stronger. Rex's growl deepened, and his body lowered slightly, as if preparing for something. She glanced around nervously, finally noticing movement in the shadows. Two figures emerged, stepping onto the path ahead of her. "Evening, ma'am," one of them said with a grin that sent a chill through Margaret. It was Kyle. He walked casually, his hands in his pockets, but there was something about the way he moved that screamed danger. Derek followed closely, his eyes darting to Margaret's purse. Margaret's heart raced. She tightened her grip on Rex's leash, instinctively stepping back. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Kyle laughed. "Yeah, you can. Why don't you hand over that purse of yours, and we'll be on our way." His tone was light, almost mocking, but his eyes were cold. Margaret clutched her purse closer, fear gripping her. "I don't want any trouble," she said shakily. "Trouble? Nah, we're just making it easier for you to get home without all that heavy stuff," Derek added, stepping closer. Rex's growl turned into a sharp bark, startling both men. Kyle stopped in his tracks, eyeing the dog for the first time. "Whoa, calm down, Grandma. Control your mutt," he said, waving his hand dismissively. But Margaret wasn't listening to him. Her focus was on Rex, whose entire demeanor had changed. His teeth were bared, his ears flat, and his sharp eyes were locked on the men. In that moment, Margaret remembered everything her late husband had told her about Rex. He wasn't just a pet. He was a trained protector. Derek took another step forward, reaching into his pocket. "Simon, lady, don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, pulling out a knife. Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at Rex, then whispered a single word she hadn't used in years: "Guard." In an instant, Rex sprang into action. His powerful body launched forward, and before Derek could react, Rex was on him. The knife clattered to the ground as Derek fell back with a yell. Kyle stared in shock. "What the?" he shouted, stumbling backward as Rex turned his attention to him. Margaret stood frozen, watching as her loyal companion defended her with the precision and strength of a soldier. For the first time that evening, Margaret felt something other than fear. She felt safe. Derek hit the ground hard, scrambling backward in panic. Rex's sharp teeth had grazed his arm as he lunged, but the dog hadn't gone for a killing blow. Instead, Rex stood over him, snarling fiercely, his massive body blocking any chance of escape. Derek's confidence vanished as he realized this wasn't just any ordinary dog. Kyle, frozen in shock for a moment, finally snapped out of it. "Get off him, you stupid mutt," he shouted, reaching into his jacket for something. But before he could make a move, Rex turned his head sharply toward him, his growl deepening. The sight of those teeth and the focused glare in Rex's eyes made Kyle hesitate. Margaret's heart was pounding, but she stood rooted to the spot, clutching Rex's leash tightly. She had seen Rex act protectively before, barking at strangers who got too close to her, but this was entirely different. This was the side of Rex her husband had once described, a highly trained army canine who could handle any threat. Derek tried to crawl away, but Rex stepped closer, snapping his teeth near Derek's leg. "Stay," Margaret commanded, her voice trembling but firm. Rex obeyed instantly, his growl softening, but he remained vigilant, keeping Derek pinned to the ground with his sheer presence. Kyle, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, tried to take charge. "All right, lady, call off your dog," he barked, stepping toward Margaret. "You don't want anyone getting hurt." But Margaret didn't back down. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of strength she hadn't known she still had. "You already tried to hurt me," she said, her voice steadier now. "And you don't know what this dog is capable of." Kyle sneered, trying to mask his growing fear. "It's just a dog," he muttered, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. He glanced at Derek, who was still frozen under Rex's watchful eyes. "Get up," he hissed, but Derek shook his head, too terrified to move. Rex didn't give Kyle a chance to get any closer. The moment Kyle shifted his weight forward, Rex barked sharply and took a single step in his direction. It wasn't a full attack, but it was enough to send Kyle stumbling back, his face pale. All right," Kyle shouted, raising his hands in surrender. "Call him off. We're leaving." Margaret didn't move. Her eyes stayed on Rex, her hand tightening on the leash as she spoke calmly but firmly. "You're not going anywhere." Kyle blinked in confusion. "What?" Margaret reached into her pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed 911, her voice steady as she reported the situation. "I'm in the park on Willow Lane," she said. "Two men tried to rob me. My dog stopped them. Yes, I'm safe. Please hurry." Kyle's fear turned to panic. "Hey, you don't need to call the cops," he protested, his voice rising. He glanced around as if looking for an escape route, but Rex's sharp gaze followed his every move. Derek whimpered from the ground. "Man, let's just go," he pleaded. But there was no escaping now. Margaret stood tall, her loyal protector by her side, as the sound of sirens began to echo in the distance. Rex stayed perfectly still, his job not yet done. Kyle's eyes darted around wildly as the faint sound of sirens grew louder. His confidence, once so bold and smug, was gone. The reality of the situation was hitting him hard. Derek, still trembling on the ground, looked up at him with desperation. "Do something," Derek hissed, his voice shaky. But Kyle had no plan. Every time he even thought about moving, Rex's sharp gaze locked onto him, and the low growl that followed froze him in place. Margaret stood firm, though her hands trembled slightly as she held the leash. Her heart was still pounding, but she refused to let fear control her. She had spent so many years doubting herself, feeling vulnerable without her late husband. Tonight, however, she realized she wasn't as helpless as she had once thought, not with Rex by her side. "Don't you dare try anything," Margaret said, her voice steady now. "The police are on their way." Kyle raised his hands defensively, his face pale. "Look, lady, we didn't mean anything by it," he stammered, trying to sound innocent. "It was just a misunderstanding, all right. No need to involve the cops." Margaret's expression hardened. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, disbelief evident in her tone. "You threatened me and pulled a knife. That's not a misunderstanding. It's a crime." Derek whimpered again, glancing nervously at Rex. "Please, lady, just call off the dog. We'll leave, I swear." Margaret shook her head. "You don't get to walk away from this. You wanted to scare me, but you didn't count on Rex." As if understanding her words, Rex let out another deep growl, his ears pinned back and his stance firm. His presence was enough to keep both men frozen in place. The sirens grew louder, and soon the flashing lights of a police car illuminated the darkening path. Margaret let out a small sigh of relief, though she kept her grip tight on Rex's leash. She wasn't letting her guard down, not until this was over. The patrol car came to a stop, and two officers stepped out, their hands on their belts as they assessed the situation. One of them, a tall man with a calm demeanor, approached Margaret cautiously. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked. Margaret nodded, her voice firm. "I'm fine, thanks to Rex. These two tried to rob me, but my dog stopped them." The officer glanced at Rex, who was still standing protectively in front of Margaret. The dog's intimidating presence didn't go unnoticed. "That's one well-trained dog," the officer remarked with a nod. Kyle and Derek didn't try to argue or resist as the officers approached them. Derek looked like he might burst into tears, while Kyle kept his eyes on the ground, his hands still raised. "It was a mistake, man," Kyle muttered weakly. "Doesn't look like a mistake to me," the second officer said as he cuffed Kyle. "You're lucky this dog only scared you. Things could have gone a lot worse." As the officers secured the two men, Margaret finally felt the tension in her body ease. She knelt down beside Rex, gently stroking his fur. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Rex gave her a small, happy wag of his tail, but his eyes never left the men until they were fully restrained and placed in the back of the police car. Even then, his posture remained alert, as if he wanted to be sure Margaret was safe. One of the officers turned back to Margaret. "We'll need your statement, ma'am, but I just want to say, you've got one incredible dog here." Margaret smiled softly, her hand resting on Rex's head. "He's more than incredible. He's my hero." As the police car drove away with Kyle and Derek inside, Margaret stood up, the weight of the moment finally settling in. But instead of fear, she felt pride. She had faced danger, and with Rex's help, she had come out stronger. The park was quiet again, the chaos fading as the flashing police lights disappeared down the road. Margaret stood for a moment, her hand resting gently on Rex's head. She could feel his steady breathing, his body still tense, but beginning to relax now that the danger had passed. She knelt down to his level, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "You saved me, Rex," she said, her eyes watering. "I don't even know what would have happened if you weren't here." Rex looked at her, his sharp eyes softening as if he understood every word. He gave a small wag of his tail, then leaned into her hand, a rare display of affection from the disciplined dog. Margaret smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. As she straightened up, she noticed a couple walking toward her from the far end of the park. They must have heard the commotion and come to see what was going on. The man, who appeared to be in his early 40s, called out as they got closer. "Ma'am, are you all right? We heard sirens and saw the lights." Margaret nodded, feeling a little overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. "I'm fine, thanks to Rex," she replied, gesturing to her dog. "Two men tried to rob me, but he stopped them." The woman gasped, covering her mouth. "That's incredible. It's he, some kind of police dog." Margaret smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Not exactly. He's a retired Army canine. My husband served with him overseas." The man's eyebrows rose in surprise. "A military dog? That explains a lot." He glanced down at Rex with newfound respect. "He's a hero." Margaret's chest tightened at the word. It brought back memories of her husband, John, and how proud he had been of Rex. John would always say that Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier, a teammate, and a protector. Margaret had seen that tonight more than ever before. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly, her voice tinged with emotion. The couple nodded, offering her warm smiles before continuing on their way, leaving Margaret and Rex alone once again. The walk back home felt different now. The evening air was cooler, the park quieter, but Margaret's mind was alive with thoughts. She kept replaying the moment when Rex had leaped into action, his instincts sharp and his loyalty unwavering. She realized just how much she had underestimated him. To her, Rex had always been her late husband's dog, a reminder of John and the life they had built together. But tonight, Rex had become something more. He wasn't just a connection to the past. He was her guardian, her partner in this new chapter of life. As they approached the house, Margaret opened the door and let Rex inside. He padded over to his favorite spot by the couch, finally lying down with a contented sigh. Margaret watched him for a moment before heading to the kitchen to pour herself a cup of tea. Sitting at the table, she stared out the window into the night, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel vulnerable or alone. Rex had reminded her of her own strength, and his. Margaret smiled softly as she glanced over at him. "You're more than a hero, Rex," she whispered. "Your family." Rex's ears twitched at her voice, but he stayed where he was, his body finally at ease. Margaret took a sip of her tea, feeling the deep sense of gratitude wash over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. Rex would be right there by her side, just as he always had been. The next morning, Margaret woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The sun was just beginning to peek through the blinds, casting a soft golden glow over the room. She sat up, stretching, and glanced over at Rex, who was already awake and sitting on his mat by the door, watching her quietly. "Good morning, Rex," Margaret said with a smile, her voice still groggy from sleep. Rex's ears perked up at the sound of his name, and his tail thumped lightly on the floor. Despite the calm morning, Margaret could still feel the lingering tension from last night. The fear, the rush of adrenaline, and the relief when the police arrived. All of it had left an imprint on her. She got out of bed and walked into the kitchen, where she started her usual morning routine. As she set about making a cup of coffee, her thoughts wandered back to the events of the previous night. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, she had been in danger, facing two men who had threatened her. And yet, in the end, it wasn't just her own strength that had saved her. It had been Rex, her loyal, trained companion. As the coffee brewed, Margaret found herself reflecting on the time she had spent with Rex, all the years they had shared with her late husband, John. John had always said that Rex had an incredible sense of duty, that he could read people and situations better than anyone. She had often thought John was just being sentimental about his old friend, but now she understood what he meant. Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a protector, a soldier, and in a way, he had been watching over her even before last night. Margaret took her coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, Rex lying contentedly at her feet. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to shake off the restlessness in her chest. It was strange how quickly life could change. One minute, she was walking through the park, enjoying the calm evening air, and the next, she was facing down two armed men with only Rex to defend her. The knock on the door broke her thoughts. Startled, she stood up and walked over, Rex following closely behind, his ears alert. Margaret opened the door, and standing there was one of the police officers from last night, Officer Harris, along with another officer she hadn't met before. "Good morning, ma'am," Officer Harris said with a polite nod. "I hope everything's all right after last night." Margaret gave him a small, appreciative smile. "It's better this morning, thank you. What brings you here?" "We just wanted to check in with you," he said, glancing at Rex. "And also, we need to ask if you'd be willing to provide a formal statement about the incident. We'll need your account for the report." "Of course," Margaret replied without hesitation, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. "I'll be happy to. Come in, please." As they entered, Margaret led them to the living room and offered them a seat. Rex sat down beside her, never taking his eyes off the officers. Margaret could tell Rex was still on alert, as though he sensed there was something important going on. Officer Harris looked over at the dog and smiled. "Your dog did an incredible job last night. I've never seen someone react so quickly." He turned his gaze back to Margaret. "You're lucky to have him with you." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I know I am," she said softly. "He's been through a lot with us, and I think last night proved just how much he's still capable of." The officers nodded, jotting down notes as they spoke. Margaret provided them with all the details she could remember, from the moment the men approached her to the way Rex had protected her without hesitation. It was surreal to think about how quickly everything had escalated, but she knew she couldn't let that moment define her. As the officers finished taking their notes, Officer Harris stood up. "Thank you for your time, ma'am. And again, we really appreciate your bravery and Rex's quick thinking." Margaret smiled, feeling a quiet sense of pride. "I'll always be grateful for Rex. He's my hero." After they left, Margaret sat back down with Rex by her side. She stared out the window for a moment, deep in thought. It had been a long, hard night, but it had also shown her something important. Rex wasn't just a reminder of her past. He was her strength, her protector in the present, and a reminder that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. A few days passed, and things slowly began to return to normal. The unsettling events of that night were still fresh in Margaret's mind, but life had a way of moving forward, no matter what happened. She resumed her daily walks with Rex, though now she couldn't help but feel a new sense of awareness as they strolled through the park. The world had felt safer before, but after that frightening night, everything seemed just a little more uncertain. Yet each step she took with Rex by her side brought a feeling of peace that she hadn't realized she had been missing. Rex, too, seemed to find comfort in their routine. Every morning, he would wake up with her, his sharp eyes always alert as he followed her movements. Margaret couldn't help but notice how much he had changed since that night. The once rigid, battle-hardened dog was now more relaxed in his role as her protector. He had always been by her side, but now it felt as if their bond had deepened in a way she never expected. They were no longer just a woman and her dog. They were a team, partners in a world that seemed a little more dangerous than it used to be. One afternoon, as they were walking down a familiar trail in the park, Margaret noticed a couple sitting on a bench, chatting quietly. She smiled at them as they passed, but then she heard a soft voice calling her from behind. "Excuse me, Mom." It was the woman from the park a few days ago, the one who had asked about Rex after the incident. Margaret turned around, her heart skipping a beat. "Oh, hello again," she said, recognizing the familiar faces. The woman smiled, and the man next to her nodded politely. "We just wanted to thank you again," the woman said, her voice warm and genuine. "We told some friends about what happened, and they couldn't believe it. We just thought it was incredible how your dog protected you. You've got a real hero on your hands." Margaret smiled, looking down at Rex, who was calmly sitting beside her. His ears perked up at the mention of his name, and he gave a soft wag of his tail. "I know," Margaret replied softly, her heart swelling with pride. "I'm just lucky to have him." The woman gave a gentle laugh. "I can tell. We saw you the other day, and we just had to come over and say how amazing it was to see that kind of loyalty and bravery. It really made us think about how important our pets are, not just as companions, but as protectors." Margaret nodded, her eyes still on Rex, who now seemed to be enjoying the attention. "He's been with me through a lot, even before that night. But yes, I think that moment really showed me just how much he's still capable of. It's not just that he's trained to protect. I think he truly cares." The man smiled at Margaret's words. "It's clear you two have a strong bond. We can't thank you enough for sharing that with us. It's made us look at our own pets a little differently, knowing that they can be so much more than just animals. They're real heroes." Margaret's smile grew. "They really are. We don't always give them the credit they deserve, do we?" After a few more words of thanks, the couple waved goodbye and continued their walk. Margaret and Rex stayed where they were, watching the couple disappear down the path. Rex gave a small huff and looked up at Margaret as if to say, "Well, that was nice." Margaret chuckled softly and rubbed his head. "You know, Rex, I think you've made more people believe in heroes than you realize." As they continued their walk, Margaret thought about how much Rex had changed her life. He had always been a part of her family, but now he felt like more than that. He was her protector, her companion, and her reminder that no matter how unpredictable life could be, there was always someone who would have her back. Rex had been there for her when she needed him most, and no matter what the future held, Margaret knew she could count on him. They were a team after all, and together they could face anything that came their way.